This is American National Forest! We yield no more! Earth first!
People were chaining themselves to trees or to trucks.
A decades-long firestorm of debate. The call to save species from extinction. The fight to save timber revenue in the counties that depend on it.
I just remember it being really a scary time.
50 years later, from the spotted owl to the gray wolf to our iconic fish species.
Salmon is really the heart of our culture.
Is the Endangered Species Act working? And if not, what needs to change?
If we just slip up for a decade, we're going to lose a tremendous amount of valuable habitat.
This is Endangered Northwest. Hi, I'm Cale Williams, environment reporter with KGW News in Portland. 50 years ago, President Richard Nixon signed one of the most far-reaching environmental laws in the land, the Endangered Species Act. So in this Environment Northwest special, we'll be looking at some of the most consequential listings under the Endangered Species Act and whether it's worked. We'll start with the northern spotted owl. The late 80s and early 90s were a tense time in the forests of the Pacific Northwest.
This is American National Forest! We yield no more! Earth first!
The controversies are very big. The trade-offs are very big.
For several years, conflict over the northern spotted owl had been building as the federal government weighed whether to provide protections for the bird. Timber towns feared the worst.
What's going to happen at Sweet Home?
What's going to happen? Sweet Home is going to die.
Their range extends from northern California to British Columbia, and they primarily feed on small mammals like mice, gophers, and tree voles.
Here he comes.
Spotted owls can grow to nearly 2 feet tall, and they usually have the same mate throughout their lives.
Oh, there she is. There she is.
Raising their young in tree cavities of forests hundreds of years old. And it's there, among the Northwest old growth, that pressure began building in the 80s to protect their rapidly diminishing habitat.
No cuts! No cuts!
Environmental advocates took to the woods,
If the logs move, we asphyxiate and die.
blocking roads and camping in trees to protest timber sales. Forestry workers rallied in small towns and big cities around the region, fearful for their jobs and their way of life.
That means I'll lose a business if they don't have the lumber industry anymore.
My dad is a forester, and my brother's a forester. My mom is a master woodland manager, and my family owns and manages about 400 acres in Oregon. So we know a lot about forestry and wildlife.
Today, Fran Cafferata is a wildlife biologist who consults for timber companies. But back then, she was a little girl, worried her father would lose his job.
You know, I just remember it being really a scary time.
BLM was nice enough to leave this little small patch of old growth.
At the same time, Doug Heiken was just starting his career as a lawyer with the environmental group that would go on to become Oregon Wild.
As a native Oregonian, I was a bit jaded about clear cuts, didn't think there was much I could do about it, but when I learned later that, we were driving species to extinction or near to extinction, and there was something we could do about it, it really changed my views.
Worked on forest issues, old growth timber harvest, spotted owls.
And Paul Henson, a wildlife biologist, was working out of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Office in Portland.
When I first came on, there were people climbing up trees and camping in the trees. In fact,
Henson, who would go on to become Oregon State Supervisor for the agency, didn't have to look far to see the conflict.
there was a guy who roped up and camped outside of our office window, 3 stories up above ground, to protest. And so it was very acrimonious, very passionate. People were chaining themselves to trees or to trucks. There was a lot of altercation, a lot of ill will, a lot of fighting.
The biggest threat facing spotted owls at the time?
The main issue, the main original issue for the spotted owl's decline was habitat loss due to massive clear-cutting of the older forests in the Pacific Northwest.
Old-growth forests are some of the most complex ecosystems in the world, home to towering conifers, lush understories, and a vast array of wildlife, including the spotted owl.
It's got huge trees that are well over 200 years old. It has a variety of ages of trees, different sizes, different species. It has a diverse understory with deciduous shrubs that provide great habitat for birds.
After more than a century of aggressive logging, old-growth forests were disappearing quickly.
Imagine the state of Oregon with virtually no old-growth forests. That's the trajectory we're on in the 70s and 80s.
But those same forests also served as the main economic driver for many of the Northwest small towns, where mills were often the central hub of the community.
I used to ride my bike to the store, a little corner store with my best friend, and we would sit outside with our little Jolly Rancher candies, and we would talk about it. It was what was being talked about around the dinner table. My dad was in forestry, her dad drove a log truck, and I was so scared that my dad would lose his job. You know, he was the breadwinner for our family.
In 1990, after years of conflict, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service finally made a decision.
Good Friday morning, it's 8:30 in Sweet Home. This is KFIR News. I'm Cindy Riley reporting. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service made its expected announcement about listing the northern spotted owl as a threatened species this morning.
The designation as a threatened species meant the government had found that without a significant change to logging practices, the owl could face extinction. It was unwelcome news in timber communities where "Save a Logger, Eat an Owl" was splashed across t-shirts and bumper stickers.
Why should the owl be protected 100% and a way of life not?
You bet I'm scared. There's a reason to be afraid. They're talking 28,000 jobs related. Well, that's a bunch of baloney. There's thousands more than that.
With the owl finally protected, the government still needed a plan for how to save it. In 1994, that came in the form of the Northwest Forest Plan. It set aside roughly 10 million acres of federal land, protecting old growth, encouraging younger forests to develop, and providing buffers near rivers and streams.
You know, during the Reagan years, the last of the big old forests on federal land were being liquidated. You know, you're talking 200, 300, 400-year-old trees that, you know, your kids and my kids, you know, have as much legacy right to as anyone else, and not as 2x4s. The Northwest Forest Plan stopped that. It put the brakes on that.
But with all that land now mostly off limits to logging, some of Cafarata's fears came true.
It had a tremendous impact on the timber industry that was scary for me.
Between 1989 and 1995, timber harvest on federal land fell by roughly 90%. But there were also other issues at play. Mechanization meant that fewer timber workers were needed, and smaller mills were being shuttered in favor of fewer, larger operations.
There was a tremendous decline in housing starts and the price of timber was going down. So it's a complicated issue. The spotted owl got most of the blame because it was easy to blame them and it was undeserved. It definitely had an impact, but not as bad as a lot of the timber industry folks like to say.
But for Heiken and other environmental advocates, the Northwest Forest Plan was a game changer.
It's an ecosystem plan. It's not just a spotted owl plan. It's going to be good for spotted owls, for salmon, for marbled murrelets that live in the Coast Range, and for all the other species that live in our old-growth forest.
And that had always been the end goal, even when protesters were camping out in the forests in the late 1980s.
The owl has worked because laws protect species. There is no federal law that protects the forest. There ought to be.
After 30 years under the Northwest Forest Plan, you might think spotted owls would be thriving, but that has not been the case. At monitoring stations in Oregon, Washington, and California, federal researchers watched spotted owl populations continue to plummet between 1995 and 2017.
That would be the female.
In some places, by as much as 80%.
Yeah.
And much of that decline was because of the barred owl, a larger and more aggressive owl native to the East Coast that began showing up in the Northwest as early as the 1970s.
They are territorial species, and so they kind of bump each other out of these ideal habitats. And the spotted owl is just a little bit smaller, just a little bit less aggressive, and the barred owl is kind of the king of the roost and tends to, you know, push the spotted owl into less ideal habitat.
Heiken says that as the spotted owl deals with this new threat, preserving habitat is more important than ever.
You have these territorial species that compete with each other for the same habitat, and for them to coexist, we need more habitat, not less. You know, if your in-laws are going to move into your house, you don't want to make your house smaller, you need to make your house bigger.
Tensions around the spotted owl have cooled significantly since the heated days of the 1990s.
Yeah, I think that
Cafarata now works with timber companies to figure out ways to harvest trees with wildlife in mind.
So we want there to be young trees, we want there to be middle-aged trees, we want there to be older trees, we want there to be a mosaic. So we're really looking for ways that we can connect habitats and allow species to live out their life histories.
And she says it's a misconception that timber companies are only looking to clear-cut as much forest as possible.
We are stewards of the forest, we care for it, and we want it to be there for us, we want it to be there for future generations, and for everybody's enjoyment.
For Hyken, he knows the fate of the spotted owl remains in doubt.
So success for this endeavor is going to be humans showing great restraint and not logging for 100 years. If we just slip up for a decade, we're going to lose a tremendous amount of valuable habitat.
But that hasn't made him any less resolute in his determination to protect it.
So when we are saving the spotted owl, we're not only saving a bird, but we're saving ourselves.
Wolves first began repopulating Oregon more than a decade ago. Let's take you now to Wallowa County. The howl of a wolf is a powerful thing. For some, it conjures feelings of awe, reverence, wildness, and independence. For others, it means a threat nearby, something that could cost them and even disrupt their way of life. In Enterprise, Oregon, tucked into the northeast corner of the state, it's not hard to find folks on either side of the issue.
The first pack was here in Wallowa County.
John Williams is the chair of the Wolf Committee for the Oregon Cattlemen's Association.
Den was down here to your right behind this tree. It was known as the Wolf Highway in the early days.
For him, the problem with wolves is close to home.
Saw the wolves come by that house with the smoke on it. In 2009, we had our first pack. The next year, all of a sudden, they started killing livestock.
Williams has been tracking the increasing presence of wolves since they arrived. And he took us to some of the hot spots.
The tallest tree right there, they went into that thicket.
Wolves have been a contentious issue since settlers came to the West.
This is where the wolves went through. Tracks right here at this gate.
As apex predators, they mostly feed on deer and elk, but they also sometimes prey on livestock, setting up a conflict with ranchers that's lasted more than 100 years. That conflict is what led to their eradication from Oregon. With bounties put on their heads, the last of Oregon's original wolves was killed in 1947. But wolves would come back to Oregon, this time with protection under the Endangered Species Act, at least for a while. Those protections were lifted more than a decade ago, so Northeast Oregon seemed the perfect place to go to find out if these animals should be seen as an endangered species success story or something else entirely.
That's the camera.
After being gone more than half a century, wolf sightings began to pop up in eastern Oregon in the mid-2000s.
We used to celebrate a lot when we would get like a picture of a wolf butt, and that was like, yeah.
As wolves from Idaho began dispersing west.
But now we actually get some really awesome pictures.
That was around the same time Rob Clavins, the field coordinator with Oregon Wild, started working on the issue.
Wolves were starting to make their way back here into Oregon, and we just realized that there really wasn't anybody advocating on behalf of wolves.
And it didn't take long for him to see the draw of wolf country.
About 10 years ago, my wife and I moved out here, and we'd really started to fall in love with the place.
Where do you think we should put the camera?
Now, when he's not working for Oregon Wild, mounting trail cams or advocating for environmental issues,
come on, babe.
Clavins runs a small working farm, a bed and breakfast outside of Enterprise, not far from John Williams' place.
Come on, guys. There you go. There you go.
So Clavins has watched firsthand as Oregon's wolf population has grown. From just a couple transplants from Idaho to more than 175 wolves, living in 24 packs. Those wolves have made their way out of Northeast Oregon and now have territory in the Cascades, in southern Oregon, and have even established the first pack in California in more than a century. And while their numbers have grown, the sentiment that led to their extermination in Oregon,
this is a wolf highway,
remains.
I cannot underestimate the emotional trauma, the stress that the wolf is putting on ranchers. It is a game changer.
As Williams sees it, wolves, or more specifically their tendency to kill livestock, are threatening the way of life ranchers have enjoyed for decades.
It's the lifestyle. It's that I get to go out and I get to run a ranch and all the things that go with it. And today, you can't say that in wolf country because lifestyle has been taken from the rancher.
Now, it's true that wolves sometimes kill livestock. Last year, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife investigated 121 suspected wolf attacks, confirming 76 of them. And that's a 55% increase from the previous year. Each wolf kill can represent a huge loss as well, with adult beef cows going for upwards of $1,500. Wolf attacks represent just a fraction of all livestock losses, though, and the state has a fund that compensates ranchers. But Williams said the effects of wolves on cattle can't just be measured in dead cows.
Their conception rate goes down about 10%. The calves come in 60 to 80 pounds lighter in the fall, if it's the right timing. These are the types of things that ranchers are dealing with. That it's not the dead animals that really economically get you.
And Williams is clear about what he thinks the solution should be.
When a wolf gets in trouble, it dies. And when it doesn't get in trouble, and it stays away from tolerant people, from people and their livestock and their private property, it lives and it breeds.
But there are rules about when a wolf can be killed in Oregon. When they first returned to the state and had federal protection, they were off limits. Protections were lifted in 2011, and wolves came under management from the state, which said wolves could only be killed in certain scenarios. Today, that means a wolf can be killed after 2 confirmed attacks within a 9-month span, but only if the rancher has used deterrents like range riders, noisemakers, and hazing. 24 wolves were killed in Oregon last year, 17 of them by humans. Of those, 6 were killed for repeated attacks on livestock, but another 7 were killed illegally.
I recognize that when it happens to you, it's a big deal, and we should do what we can to prevent it. But we just think that killing wolves should truly be the option of last resort.
Beyond that, he points to research that shows killing wolves often comes with unintended consequences. Wolves have complex social structures, and killing just one wolf in a pack can sometimes make the remaining wolves more likely to look for easy prey, like livestock.
When you shoot the wrong wolf, when you disrupt those pack structures, you disrupt the social dynamics of that pack, and you often make problems worse, which is why...
Clavins was quick to acknowledge that he doesn't know all the ins and outs of ranching like ranchers do, and there's no silver bullet to the problem.
I often liken killing wolves to itching a mosquito bite. It's easy, it's cathartic, it's just kind of the reflexive thing you do and sort of, oh, that should work. But the reality is that when you look at the science, it shows that there are better ways to do things.
So if you've been paying attention to wolf issues in the Pacific Northwest, this story might feel a little familiar so far. You've got ranchers on one side who want to protect their livestock. You've got wolf advocates on the other who want to protect the wolves. But there's another group that often gets left out of the conversation.
My name is Julian Matthews. I'm an enrolled member of the Nez Perce tribe.
In the mid-90s, the Nez Perce played an instrumental role in bringing wolves back to this part of the West. The federal government had been considering reintroducing wolves in the West for years, but Idaho's state legislature voted against the plan. So in 1994, the Nez Perce became the first tribe to lead the reintroduction of an endangered species into its native territory.
You know, they did these ceremonies, the elders were there singing songs and welcoming our brother wolf, the spirit of the wolf, back to our land.
Well, the wolf and other animals...
Wilbur Slockish Jr. is an elder in the Klickitat band of Yakima Nation, and he remembers hearing stories about the wolf from his grandmother and the role they played on the landscape.
And I distinctly remember her talking about the wolf. The wolf, he was there to take care of the sick, the old, and the injured animals. We would eat no disease or sickly animal or injured animal. That was his food.
You know, as tribal members, we have...
and while Matthews looks back with pride at the role his tribe played in wolves returning to the West,
they're living beings, and so we want to protect that.
He fears for their future.
So the Creator put us here to live here, and so we should feel the same respect towards them. Politically, they're not popular.
In my mind, we need to get control of it.
Despite their political unpopularity and some ranchers wanting more freedom to kill them, wolf populations have been growing across the West.
Yes, guys, yes.
And both Clavins and Williams, two people who don't agree on much about wolves, say they've seen things move in the right direction. Williams says the state has been more responsive to the concerns of ranchers, even if he wished they were quicker.
In the last 6 months, we've seen changes. As I tell them, it's not near fast enough for what's happening out here with our livestock, the losses that we're having.
Come on, Pig.
And Clavins, he says that the heated debates from a decade ago have cooled.
In the time that I've been here, I've seen attitudes change. Certainly there are still really entrenched views, but generally I think things have moderated.
So does that mean that gray wolves should be looked at as a win for the Endangered Species Act? For all they disagree on, Clavins and Williams both say no, though their reasons differ.
You know, should there be wolves here? I think it's fine that we have wolves where wolves should be. And, They're going to get there eventually because of the Endangered Species Act. But it's a sledgehammer when a tap hammer should have been used.
The Endangered Species Act has been successful in making species not go extinct. It hasn't been as good at getting species to biological recovery, but to the extent it's fallen short there, it's not because the Endangered Species Act is broken, it's because it's starving. We need more protections for wildlife, especially in an age of climate change and increasing development.
Few endangered species have impacted the tribes of the Northwest, like the decline of Pacific salmon. And it's hard to overstate their importance. Salmon are interwoven into the very fabric of our region, from the economy to the culture.
Salmon is really the heart of our culture. You know, we're salmon people.
Danila Miller is a member of Yakima Nation, and for her, salmon are much more than just fish.
When we're born, you know, we drink our mother's milk, but salmon was always our first food. That was the first solid food that I ate. And so it's our responsibility to care for them.
Miller is also fisheries science manager for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission.
Evaluating the hatchery programs. We have a genetics lab in southern Idaho, and we have a river ecology project.
She's had a front row seat as salmon populations have declined over the last several decades. To understand the threats facing salmon, you have to understand the complexity of their life cycle.
They're a highly migratory species. They begin life hatching in the upper portions of watersheds in tributaries of the system. And they move their way down out of those tributaries into the major river systems. They then find their way to the estuaries. They go to the ocean to mature. Right.
Kim Kratz is an assistant regional administrator with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They're the federal agency charged with overseeing salmon recovery. And he explains that throughout their lives, salmon face threats at nearly every turn.
Traditionally, we looked at the threats to salmon by the 4 H's. There's habitat, there's harvest, there's hatcheries, and there's the hydro system.
More recently, sea lions and predatory birds have been added to the list of threats.
And then there's climate change. And climate change adds and increases the risk to all of those 4 H's.
It's a complex issue, and you can't pinpoint one specific thing. I always refer to it as death by 1,000 cuts.
While salmon face many threats, dams stand out among them. Each of the dozens of dams throughout the Columbia and Willamette River system present an obstacle to salmon. They're hard to pass for young fish who are following the current out to the Pacific. And they're just as hard to get by for adult salmon, trying to navigate back to their spawning grounds.
We are constantly evaluating.
That's where Tim Dykstra comes in. He's in charge of making sure salmon can get past the dams.
And in the case of the Army Corps of Engineer dams on the 4 lower Columbia and the 4 lower Snake dams, they all have effective fish ladders that quickly and effectively pass adult fish back to their spawning grounds.
Dykstra said the Army Corps has changed its operations so that fewer young salmon die passing through the turbines.
So we've installed major infrastructure upgrades, screens that divert fish from entering the turbines. We've provided a lot of spill at the spillway at the dams so that they have non-turbine routes to pass.
But dams do more than just create barriers for salmon. They create low-cost, carbon-free electricity, and they facilitate shipping and irrigation for farmers.
We recognize there are impacts of dams, we recognize there are benefits of dams, and we take our fish and wildlife responsibilities very seriously.
But dams also fundamentally change how the river flows.
The great river of the West tearing toward the sea at Celilo Falls.
Those falls were the water purifiers.
Wilbur Slockish Jr. is an elder with the Klickitat Band of Yakima Nation. He remembers fishing at Celilo Falls, a series of thundering cascades that used to be east of the Dalles.
Oh, man, that's a sound that can't be replicated. And the fish, there was plenty of fish all the time because the water was cold, free-flowing.
Today, the falls are quiet, inundated when the dams went up.
They flooded spawning beds behind Bonneville Dam, where our people fished.
And that gets to another big threat for salmon: habitat loss. Along the coast, tidal estuaries have been converted to pastures. Further inland, Vast wetland areas have been cut off from the river. The Polensky Wildlife Area, just north of Portland on the backwaters of the Willamette, is one of those areas. A few years ago, it was more than 400 acres of disconnected habitat, parts of it cut off from the river for nearly a century by culverts and water diversions.
What we did here was we actually lowered over about a 4.5 acre area. We actually brought down the marsh plain about 2.5 feet. And so this
Tom Josephson, with the Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force, helped lead the restoration project in the wildlife area.
And so now fish can get from that slough channel into these wetland areas back in here, and it provides a lot more landscape connectivity across the site.
And his agency worked closely with the Bonneville Power Administration, which runs the hydropower side of the dams on the Columbia River.
It's the gift that keeps on giving.
Jason Karnezis leads the estuary program for BPA, and he says projects like this one are meant to offset the damage that dams do.
As a federal agency, you take the responsibility of recognizing the impacts that you have on the environment. You put that work on the ground as best you can according to the science.
And while the work will be good for salmon, he stressed that it's about more than that.
So we're trying to restore processes, not just a specific one-size-fits-all habitat for salmonids.
Whether habitat restoration projects like this one will work will take time to tell, but Karnezis is confident.
We've documented those things over time and have found that the adage of if you build it, they will come is true.
But even some programs created to help salmon haven't quite worked out as planned. Since the late 1800s, people have been using salmon hatcheries to augment fish stocks.
What we try to do, what hatcheries are intended to do, is to boost harvest opportunities while at the same time reducing the risk to ESA-listed fish.
But intent and reality don't always align. Kratz said that hatchery fish have altered genetics, giving those salmon lower chances of survival.
It seems like they're less able to respond to some of the threats that they've got because they have a more homogeneous set of DNA.
And you don't need to be a scientist to notice the difference between hatchery and wild fish.
The fish have gotten smaller since they put into those little salmon reservations that are called hatcheries.
The real danger, though, comes if hatchery fish breed with their wild counterparts, passing along those inferior genes. Kratz said hatchery managers are careful about when they release hatchery fish to limit their interaction with wild salmon. But the idea that hatcheries could bring salmon back from the brink has proven false.
You know, it used to be that we thought that hatcheries were a direct replacement for declining fish populations, and now we realize that hatcheries provide an important benefit and they can be used for conservation, but they're not the silver bullet.
So with threats coming at salmon from all sides, why are people still allowed to fish for them? Simply put, salmon are foundational for a big part of the Northwest economy.
These fisheries provide tens of thousands of jobs. There are hundreds of communities that are reliant for a resilient economy on these fisheries.
But they're also more than that.
They're part of the fabric of the West Coast region with respect to culture and the economy. With respect to the indigenous people, it's part of they're inextricable from their culture, from their economy, from their art, from their ceremony.
And that's what makes the issue so personal for people like Wilbur Slockish and Danilo Miller.
All of this is really emotional for me because it's part of who I am and my culture.
And it's that cultural connection that keeps Miller working to save salmon.
And I see it as just carrying on the work of my elders and my ancestors, and and setting the stage for our future generations to continue on this work to protect our environment.
Despite the setbacks, there have been signs of progress. Some runs like Oregon Coast Coho and Hood Canal Chum have shown promising signs of recovery. And the biggest dam removal in U.S. history is currently underway on the Klamath River, which will restore access to hundreds of miles of salmon habitat. But for true change to happen, Miller says it will take a fundamental shift in how people interact with their environment.
The tribal perspective that I grew up with, that I was taught by my ancestors, is that our natural resources were put here to sustain us, and so it's our responsibility to care for them and ensure their existence for future generations.
The Endangered Species Act, for all the good it's done, won't be enough.
I think it has the potential that it could be the most powerful tool that we have to protect species from extinction, but really yet to see the success of that. All of these species listed in the 90s in the Columbia River Basin, how many of those have been restored?
Slockish knows he'll never see salmon runs like his ancestors did. But he still remembers the first salmon he ever caught, and the message it delivered.
Just like looked me in the eye, and I looked at him, and I got the message there, you know, I did my job, now you do yours, you take care of me.
So for all the fighting, all the conflict, has the endangered species actually worked? Are any of these animals actually better off now than they were when they were first listed? I asked the experts.
Two very fundamental American ideals come crashing together, and one is this concept of Teddy Roosevelt, Wild West, you know, wildlife, preserving that, and private property rights. You know, private property rights is a very American ideal. And how do you reconcile those two?
That's Paul Henson, who worked as Oregon State Supervisor for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service before retiring recently. In his view,
the ESA, Endangered Species Act, is an unequivocal success.
Right.
And Kim Kratz, who helps oversee salmon recovery for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Oh, I think that the Endangered Species Act has had a pretty significant role in keeping these populations from going extinct.
That's not exactly a surprising take from two people in charge of implementing the act. But Henson explained his reasoning.
You know, it stopped extinctions. It impressed upon the country the need not just to keep species from going extinct, but preserve the habitats, or in the language of the act, the ecosystems upon which they depend.
The romance of pig farming. All right, come on.
But what about the people who share the land with the animals protected under the act?
Come on, pig.
Their opinions are a little more mixed. Here's Rob Clavins, who's been advocating for wolf recovery in eastern Oregon since wolves returned to the state nearly 15 years ago.
The Endangered Species Act has been successful in making species not go extinct. It hasn't been as good at getting species to biological recovery, but to the extent it's fallen short there, it's not because the Endangered Species Act is broken, it's because it's starving. We need more protections for wildlife, especially in an age of climate change and increasing development.
John Williams, who chairs the Wolf Committee for the Oregon Cattlemen's Association, also has his issues with the ESA.
The federal protection that wolves had here, was that successful in your mind?
No. He says the act is a blunt instrument that's been co-opted by special interest groups.
The sledgehammer of the Endangered Species Act has been hijacked by people with agendas, and that's usually when we get bad management.
Looking at the bigger picture and the context.
Danella Miller is the fisheries science manager for the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. As a member of Yakima Nation, she's been working to save salmon for most of her life. And for her, the Endangered Species Act has a ton of promise, but she's still waiting to see it realized.
All of these species listed in the 90s in the Columbia River Basin, how many of those have been restored?
But there have been successes under the Endangered Species Act. Not so long ago, the bald eagle looked to be headed toward extinction. Today, their numbers are close to 300,000.
I see bald eagles flying over my house here, and I'm 2-3 miles from downtown Portland. I see them all the time, and 20 years ago, we thought eagles were also going to go extinct.
The borax lake chub, a tiny fish that lives only in a small lake in Oregon, was listed as endangered in 1980, but removed in 2020 after the land surrounding its home was set aside for conservation. It was the first time a fish had made it off the endangered species list due to recovery. And it's not just birds, mammals, and fish. Nelson's checker mallow, a flowering plant with bright pink blooms native to Pacific Northwest prairies, staged a remarkable comeback and was taken off the list just this year.
Because enough landowners have private landowners have provided habitat for that plant.
Oh, there she is.
And there's some cause for optimism for the Northwest's most high-profile endangered species, too. Last month, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service proposed killing roughly 400,000 barred owls in Oregon and Washington over the next 30 years. While that might not be welcome news if you're a barred owl, studies have shown spotted owl populations have stabilized when their larger, more aggressive counterparts are removed. And talks continue around the removal of 4 large dams on the Snake River. Tribes and salmon advocates have been pushing to breach the dams for years to improve prospects for salmon, though many in the inland Northwest have raised concerns about the loss of hydropower, irrigation, and shipping. And for the wolf, the state now feels like the species has reached a big enough population in Oregon to export some wolves. Colorado voters approved a plan to reintroduce the species there, and Oregon will be sending up to 10 of its wolves to the state early next year. But despite the successes and reasons for guarded optimism, the ESA still has lots of room for improvement.
And it's pretty good at keeping the species just hovering just above extinction, but it's not terribly great at recovering species and getting them to be a really healthy population again.
Henson said he'd like to see changes to the act that would prioritize action well before a species gets so close to extinction.
The moment where you'd get the most conservation done is before something's listed, but when a listing is imminent. So how do you kind of impress upon folks you have this urgency, but you don't get locked into an inevitable path of having to list?
And a more proactive approach to conservation will only become more important as climate change and human development continue to increase.
There's too much at stake to allow these to continue to decline and not to invest in a long-term recovery strategies.
Even if that sometimes makes for some difficult conversations.
I think it says something good about us if we can make room on the landscape and in our hearts for all native wildlife, not just to exist, but to actually thrive, and especially those species that challenge us the most.
Whether the Endangered Species Act has worked or not is open to interpretation. But one thing is certain. It remains our best tool for keeping important species, the fish in our rivers, plants in our forests, the birds in our skies, from disappearing forever. I'm Cale Williams. Thanks for watching.